A fair while ago, I had a conversation with Coltane about the drug war and drug policy and drug legalization. And in it, if I recall correctly, he expressed the position that most drugs could be or should be legalized, but he had some apprehensions about crystal meth. And if I recall correctly, it was due to its particularly addictive properties. I'm not entirely sure, so don't quote me on that. In any event, he had a pretty complex position on it, and it wasn't all-encompassing, which is to say, he did not wholesale support or endorse the legalization of all drugs across the board. Now, I would argue that one would be hard-pressed to describe this position. Is Coltane for drugs, for drug legalization, or is he against it? I suppose you could argue in the majority, yes, he is for that. But the reason I bring this up is because we live at a very peculiar time. We live in an age of the either or. Either one has a singular, unyielding, and very unnuanced position, or one has some other position which is equally unyielding, singular, and unnuanced. And this seems to color and characterize every discussion we have, and by we I mean human beings, across the board. Whatever the topic, whatever the theme of the day, it's always either or. So the question once again begets itself. Is Coltane for drug legalization, or is he against it? It really is impossible to tell unless you have a long, lengthy chat with him where you hash out the details. But the world we've created for ourselves is such that the position cannot be represented, certainly not by the conventional polarities we apply to everything, this either or. So in our world, the world of convention, the world of 2016, the world that is just everywhere we look and everything we hear, it tells us, here we have two positions. You're either for drug legalization or against it. Now, this should strike most people as a bit absurd. Even people who, tendency-wise, would completely fall on one pole rather than the other, and gravitate towards complete legalization or complete illegalization, probably have a somewhat more nuanced position than that. But in this dimension of sound bites we live in, that's all there is room for, right? For drug legalization, against it. Same applies, of course, to immigration. Are you for immigration, or are you against it? Now, it should be obvious to many people that there are a wide variety of positions that one can take and one can have with regards to immigration, neither fully endorsing a wholesale, no-holds-bars immigration of anyone and every comer who seeks it, nor prohibiting it in every respect. There are degrees, there is nuance, and there are variations. The kind of immigration I would endorse, for example, would be an immigration of carefully selected individuals, means testing, perhaps IQ means testing, education levels, background checks, skill levels, relevance, etc. Would that include the alt-rights, no brown-skinned people or dark-skinned people? No. I'm concerned solely with education levels, IQ, etc., and a willingness, of course, to adapt and indeed conform to the local customs and culture. Is that a pro-immigration stance? I suppose it is. It's not the pro-immigration stance you would find amongst many people on the left, though. It's quite different, even radically different. On the other hand, you can also describe me as anti-immigration, because I do not endorse the wholesale immigration of anyone and any person who chooses to cross a border and wants to take up residence someplace. That's absurd, and it doesn't work particularly well for a wide variety of reasons. Crime, inability to contribute to the society, and just sheer numbers. I mean, the resources required to take care of people like that. So depending on which side of the argument of the pole you might be, someone could call me anti-immigration or pro-immigration, but neither of the terms are particularly well applicable to me as an individual with the positions that I seek to represent there. And this just goes, our society is just shot through with this either-or position. And it's inexorable. You cannot offer, at least in a mainstream sense, a position on anything that's more nuanced than this. Now, one thing I'm not arguing is that the middle ground is necessarily the best place you have to be. There is, after all, a sort of middle ground fallacy one can commit. It's not that the middle ground is necessarily better, hardly. It's just that complex political issues, and even issues of heritage, which I'll get into a bit, and ethnicity and culture are not simple mathematical equations or even basic arithmetic. It's not a question of 2 + 2 = 4 and anything else is wrong. I wish it were that simple, but it's not. All these things do have nuance to them because people have different positions. Some of them might match up better with reality than others, some less so. But I mean, take the question of identity. It's identitarianism. Now, I've been accused and misrepresented numerous times by people, especially on the alt-right, as someone who advocates, non-identitarianism, or a dissolute individualism that has nothing to do with one's surroundings or background or anything like that. And this, of course, is a straw man. It's not my position at all. The question of identity, though, is a bit more complicated than what you'll find on, not even fringe, the far left, or what you would traditionally find amongst white nationalists or the alt-right. I mean, technically in the left, I guess there is no such thing as identity. Everything is fluid and always changing, and you're either everything, here we go, or you're nothing. So everyone is everything, or they're nothing at the same time. It's a very dilute and poorly defined sense of identity. On the other hand, you have a position that's typically taken on the alt-right that your genetics and your heritage, and even in some cases your haplotype, defines everything of what you are, or at least the most important bits of what you are, and everything you do in your life should be in accord with that. And I've seen this position represented numerous times. I'm not creating a straw man. And I think of it as a bit more nuanced and complicated than that. So as I've said many times, I'm, genetically, in terms of autosomal DNA, almost entirely Eastern European. But I spent almost the entirety of my time on this planet in the West, as a child and a teenager in the United States. And then, as an adult, virtually all of my time, in terms of living, not visiting, in Western Europe. I've lived in Iceland. I've lived in Germany, I've lived in the United Kingdom, I've lived in France, I've lived in Austria, I've lived in Switzerland. And from a fairly young age, late teenagehood onwards, I got into my head that I really wanted to understand Western civilization. I wanted to understand the mechanisms that brought it about. And above all, I wanted to understand the languages. To this end, I studied Latin very intensely, and to a somewhat lesser degree Greek. My Latin is to this day much better than my Greek is. I studied French and German intensely because these were languages that had made tremendous contributions in the realms of history, philosophy, and science, the development of early modern Western thought. And above all, as an Anglophone, as a speaker of modern Anglo-Saxon, otherwise called English, I almost felt myself duty-bound to understand the history and the development of the English language. After all, this was my mother tongue, and not understanding it seemed almost a sin to me. How did it get to where it is right now? And language is our sole means of expression and understanding the world. Soul is a bit exaggerated, I suppose, but it is our primary means. And so I took it upon myself, in addition to studying things like Latin and Greek and modern languages like French and German intensely, studying the history of the English language, Old English. To this day, barring some vocabulary I've forgotten, I can still read it decently. Middle English, and everything related to that. Why did I even live in Iceland? Well, that was to understand Old Norse, because modern Icelandic has changed very little in that time, and Scandinavian languages, particularly Old Norse, had enormous influence on English. Now, of course, I'm not an Anglo-Saxon genetically. I have no relationship other than perhaps a distant one. But that didn't really matter because culturally, everything I had absorbed and everything that was important to me was a product of Western civilization. And I sought to understand that and do my very best to understand that in the way I saw fit. I'm not claiming that my means or methods were the only ones, but I wanted to understand the culture and the language, and to my mind, and within the limits of my abilities, that was the best way of pursuing that goal. And it's funny because culturally speaking, I am a Western European. I've lived in Western Europe most of my adult life. The languages that I speak fluently are all Western European languages. And to be frank, despite being Eastern European genetically, I've only visited Eastern Europe. I've traveled much more extensively through Western Europe. I've been to every Western European country. On my mother's side, I do have some Ukrainian ancestry, but I've never even been to Ukraine. And frankly speaking, I have no interest in visiting Ukraine, especially given the problems there now. But neither here nor there. That might be my genetic heritage, but the cultural heritage I've received has been one which has influenced me far more than that. It's entirely possible that it could have gone the other way, but it didn't. Now, I'm sure people on the alt-right might argue, oh, that's all artificial. Well, more than a decade of study has borne great fruit in this regard, and I can assure you the results have been palpable. But artificial or not, they're there. And artificial or not, I personally attribute far more importance to a cultural heritage that I'm part of than anything else. Now, I've talked about this before, sort of cultural assimilation. Doesn't mean that I ignore certain things. I would never claim to be genetically Western European, Icelandic, Anglo-Saxon, anything like that. But the English language, being my mother tongue, is part of my heritage, as it were. It is part of my way of conducting myself in the world. And I thought it was very important in my younger years to understand that and comprehend that. And why I'm talking about this at all is to demonstrate that there are gradients and degrees in these things. I mean, it's not that I advocate no identity and a perfect individualism. It's that things are a little bit more complicated than you're an individual with nothing to you other than your individuality. And you're just a bag of DNA and haplotypes, and everything you do in life should somehow be in accord with that. Or, on the other end, you're everything. I can assure you that I'm not Korean. I lived in South Korea for more than 2 years. One of the first conflicts I had with people there, interestingly enough, was with my then boss at the Hagwon, and we were in a kind of discussion about respect, and I, of course, with my Euro-American vision of what respect might be, didn't understand what he meant. He meant deference, lost in translation, and as much as linguistic translation as a cultural one, because in South Korean culture, Neo-Confucian culture, it's all about deference. It's all about slavish obedience. I never really liked that about Korean culture, and to be frank, I wasn't particularly happy there for a variety of reasons, but that was one of them. It didn't jive with me. I could never claim to be Korean. It's not, and because the culture doesn't resonate with me. I didn't grow up there, and I didn't absorb it. Neither am I African or Argentinian. Now, had I grown up in a place like Buenos Aires, I probably would very much, even considering my Eastern European genetics, feel more Argentinian than I do American or European or whatever. The point I'm making is that people are the product of their circumstances and environment. And so when it comes to questions of identity, it's not an either or. I can acknowledge genetic roots and separate them from what I consider cultural roots, which have had a far greater impact on my own, as the Germans like to say, Werdegang, or path in life, than influences from the East, Eastern Europe. Like I said, I have, despite having some Ukrainian ancestry, I can't really claim to be interested in Ukraine in the slightest, really. Much more interested in Hungary. I visited there several times. But even there, it's more of an intellectual interest. Hungarian seems like a cool language, and at some point in time, I'd like to master it, that kind of thing. But it's not because I feel some deep connection with Hungary or anything like that. And when we talk about identity, it's the same issue as with every other issue. It's just either or. Now, why did I bring this up in particular and talk at length about it was a conversation that Stefan Molyneux had with Vox Populi, the voice of the people, who is, I guess, a prominent alt-writer, and he was going on about various things. So it was very informative for people who don't know very much about the alt-right. And he talked about how originally the United States was just white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So fair enough. And then the Italians came, and the Irish came, and they weren't really Americans. They wouldn't consider them that, and it all changed. I don't want to talk about the whole discussion here, but the point is that things do change, and we could go back even further and say, well, I mean, at some point in time, the majority of Americas were inhabited by so-called Native Americans who presumably across the Bering Strait when it was frozen over many, many millennia ago. I mean, at the end of the day, we are living in the present. You can reverence the past to some degree. The fact of the matter is, in my own way, I have reverenced the past by studying the languages of the past, such as Latin and Greek, my own linguistic heritage, English, by delving into the mysteries of Beowulf and poems such as The Wanderer, and reading the Venerable Bede, both in Latin and in Old English, and all sorts of things along those lines. But it doesn't define me singularly. It's not the only aspect of my being. And it's just impossible in the arena these days that we have for discussion, the forum, as it were, to have a nuanced discussion about these things. You can be perfectly honest about all these aspects of different things, whether it comes to drug legalization or the drug war or immigration or questions of identity. And you can't really have a discussion which is open-ended and open-minded, for that matter. And you just end up in this trap which you can't escape from. You're either this or that. This is the inexorable either-or of the world we live in. And it is damaging, I think, to any intellectually honest conversation you want to have about these things. I mean, there are, of course, degrees of things. I would never claim, for example, that I'm German, though most often I can pass myself off as a German. I'm not German. I don't really feel nearly as connected to German culture as I do to, I suppose, aspects of Anglo-Saxon culture or what have you. But I still recognize the importance of German and the development of things like science and Enlightenment thought and philosophy and all these things, and that's why I studied it intensely. So, you can be honest about these things without misrepresenting yourself, but at the same time, no one is solely one thing or another, I think, ultimately. Of course, you can make your entire life about being, I don't know, Anglo-Saxon or English. And I think it's interesting that a lot of these guys who do this, they don't take the time to study Anglo-Saxon English. And I would argue a lot of these people who are descendants of Anglo-Saxons, they don't know the English language half as well as I do, nor do they know anything about the history in detail. And it's kind of strange, to make a big deal about some heritage which singularly defines you and to know so little about it. But neither here nor there. I'm just tired, personally, of both the alt-right and the far left, or the aggressive left as they're called. There's just no room for a discussion that includes all the details without just gravitating to one pole or the other. And as long as we're stuck in this either-or society, we end up, for example, with, frankly speaking, candidates such as Clinton and Trump. Are you for Trump or are you against him? Are you for Clinton or are you... Well, I'm not for either, frankly speaking, but there are plenty of people who tentatively support Clinton or tentatively support Trump, but it's not a wholesale endorsement. In fact, there are many caveats in their various forms of support, and you cannot say they're Trump supporters, at least in a traditional sense. There's one or two aspects. There might be one or two aspects to Trump that they find appealing, or even Clinton, and they're kind of voting. They're sort of holding their noses and voting for one or two of these candidates based on these few issues that concern them, but they dislike so much else and so many other issues surrounding the candidate, but they're sort of forced to gravitate towards that regardless. This is not the society we're living in. Everything is a soundbite. Everything you discuss is a soundbite. And this is another reason why we get, I guess, memes that crop up which actually misrepresent science. I mean, take R and K selection theory, which I really do want to, in the not too distant future, go to town on and dissect in detail. I mean, people on the alt-right are literally applying it to political parties and whatever. There's no place there whatsoever. It has nothing to do with that. So it's really difficult to make sense of this unless you listen to the entirety of a discussion. But who does that these days? We are lost and adrift in a sea of either or. Either you're for this or you're against it. And the reality is most people who aren't simpletons have a much more complex, nuanced position. I mean, on a final note, take Coltain. Coltain accurately, if you were to accurately describe his politics, is left of center. Not even far leftist, he's just somewhat left of center. Whereas I guess if you were to accurately describe mine, I would be somewhat right of center. I still managed to get along. But to call him a communist or far left, it's just not, it's inaccurate. It's not accurate. But this is this either or thing. Whereas a lot of people would say, no, you're libertarian or you're this. I even have people calling me a leftist. I never understood that. But this is not helping us to make progress here. Whatever the issue might be, the issue of the day, the soup du jour, I can assure you it's going to be much more nuanced and complicated than one or two or even three positions. There is like I said, there's a range of positions that, frankly speaking, we never get to talk about in open discourse. And I think if we want to have an honest discussion about all these issues that people are concerned with, we need to move away from the either-or paradigm and move towards a more nuanced paradigm where different aspects of things can be discussed in full detail, and people are granted the time to do so, and people are willing to listen when people actually describe these things, rather than just positioning them automatically in some corner or some box and saying leftist or anti-immigration, pro-immigration, or whatever it might be. This is me simply calling for an intellectually honest discussion rather than polarizing views that, frankly speaking, don't describe reality half the time. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, and I will check you out later. Enjoy the forthcoming weekend in whatever time zone you might be. May Zeus watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.